esteemed panelists here. So Andrew Keen, I'm sure you all know, self-declared Antichrist of Silicon Valley, a professional controversialist, which is a good gig if you can get it, and the author of The Cult of the Amateur, How the Internet is Killing Our Culture. So I think you know where he's coming at our first panel today, which is all about Internet optimism, pessimism, the future of culture. To my right is Adam Thierer, who I worked with for the last 3 years at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. Adam has had a long career in the think tank world at PFF, Cato, Heritage, and is now at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And someone that, again, I've really had the great honor of working with and who I look up to as a mentor and have been happy and proud to have as a co-author. On my left, Ann Bartow teaches at the University of South Carolina School of Law. Her scholarship focuses on intellectual property, as well as privacy, technology law, and feminist legal theory. And I promise Ann that in future we will make every effort to correct the great gender imbalance in our field. Jonathan Zittrain is not here today, as you can tell, but he is here in spirit. He had to teach all day, but his chapter in the book is really essential to this topic that we'll be talking about here today. So Frank Pasquale, who has 2 essays in the book on later chapters, has been kind enough to join us on this panel to speak out a little bit for what I would call a certain sort of pessimism. And since he's writing a book called The Black Box, I think he might agree that that's a little bit pessimistic. So that's not meant to be a loaded term. But Frank teaches law at Seton Hall and is now visiting fellow at Princeton's University Center for Information Technology Policy. So I want to thank all of you here today. And just by way of background, want to explain that this panel is a combination of 2 chapters in the book. The first 2 chapters are about the future of culture, and that's where Adam and Andrew and Ann have their essays. And the second chapter is about pessimism generally, and this is where Adam, I think, articulates his second theory of pessimism. So, Adam, do you want to kick us off by just explaining what you mean by those 2 schools of pessimism?
Well, sure. Thanks, Berin, and I want to congratulate you and TechFreedom on your successful launch today. Of the many people I've had the pleasure of working with over the past 20 years and 5 different think tanks now, Berin's been one of the biggest joys and a great Padawan learner that I know will never turn to the dark side. So, or else I will slay him. So, congratulations, Berin, and it's really exciting. I know you're going to make a huge contribution.
And I should explain that Jeff Manny suggested that this was Eric Goldman, this is a geek on geek event. So there may be Star Trek and Star Wars and perhaps even Dungeons and Dragons references.
Some lightsaber play ones too. So very briefly, I have 2 contributions to this book, and what a book it is. It's an amazing collection of essays, really the all-stars of cyber law really aggregated in this book. And my contributions have to do with Internet optimism and pessimism and the case that is made against the Internet. And what I've tried to do in my introductory chapter is to discuss the 2 variants of Internet pessimism as I see them developing today in the field of cyber law and Internet policy. The first variant I think will be fairly familiar to everyone here, and I think Andrew is a fairly good exponent of it in a lot of his work, the sort of dour, pessimistic view that somehow there's not a lot of hope that the Internet is really going to change society, culture, humanity for the better. That it really is there was a supposed good old days when things were much better, and the Internet, this newfangled thing, is ultimately going to take us to a different world and not a better one. I wouldn't say that this variant of pessimism is Ludditism. It doesn't always, it's not always represented with radical calls for, break the machines, let's roll back the clock, but it sometimes borders on it, and it certainly calls into question the wisdom of continuing to go down the path of further digitization, a broadening of the Internet and the scope of these technologies in our lives, so on and so forth. The second variant of pessimism that I've identified, which may be a little less familiar to some, and some would claim it's not pessimism, is a pessimism from people who actually embrace the Internet in some ways. They're what I would call net lovers, but they are very pessimistic about the future of the Internet, or the future of openness, or the future of, as Jonathan Zittrain calls it, generativity and generative devices. And it's not just Jonathan that's he's probably the leading exponent of this thesis right now, but in his book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. But it really started with Larry Lessig's code, which is in many ways a Bible for the field of cyber law and the place where most students begin their study of it. And when you read between the lines, or not even between the lines, when you read them directly, Larry's book is a fairly dark book because it opens with this notion that, as Berin's already mentioned, that left unfettered, cyberspace will lead to a world of perfect control. And that the code as law kind of notion that he set forth there is really it's an effort by him to foreshadow a world where private code actually leads to more law on our lives, and therefore we need actual law to regulate that private code. So Jonathan's new book, Future of the Internet, How to Stop It, and more recently Tim Wu's new book, The Master Switch, are really, in my mind, sort of a trilogy of sorts that really expose and discuss, delineate the confines of this theory of Internet policy. And the attitude on display in these books seems to be one of, it seems to imply that we're at the cusp of the beginning of a digital dark age of closed systems, where everything's being closed up and corporate American, schemers are sort of taking over our cyber liberties, and I've disputed this in more articles and blog posts than I care to number, but in my second chapter in the book, I try to challenge that view by making the argument that actually things are probably more open than they ever have been before. They're more generative than they ever have been before, and that quite frankly, I think we have more reasons for optimism than ever before. So I haven't gotten into detail about either of my theories in terms of debunking these notions of pessimism, but maybe it's a good chance for me to hand off. And
yeah, well, Frank, since you're here, sort of channeling Wu, Lessig, and Zittrain. Again, Wu and Zittrain both have essays in the book, and just couldn't be here. Why don't you stand up for what I would think is the dominant trend in internet law?
Sure, and thanks so much for the invitation. It really is a tribute to your open-mindedness that you would have me here. I think that it is to give a precis of Lessig, Wu, and Zittrain is a pretty tough job. But let me try to give the Cliff's Notes version, I think, of how they might respond. To Adam's point, and the blog I run called Conquering Opinions, we had a symposium on the future of the internet. We had some great posts from Adam and others there. We're doing one on Tim Wu's Master Switch next month. I've gotten about halfway through that. Another very interesting read. And of course, there's Lessig. And I think the argument that all of these thinkers are making, I think, or where they converge, if there is sort of a school of internet studies that can be called, say, progressive internet studies rather than, I think, pessimistic internet studies, because I think ultimately what they're trying to do is to try to assure progress towards some better endpoint, and to situate internet studies within a larger progressive agenda. I think if there's a main point of that, one is that you've got to look at a lot of the leading powers on the internet the way that we've looked at utilities in the past. Okay? And when I would make this analogy in the article Federal Search Commission I did about a couple of years ago, and others had made that analogy, people are willing to think about that in the terms of ISPs. They're willing to think about that in terms of cable and phone companies. 5 years ago, when I started making arguments like this, no one was willing to entertain it. But we've sort of seen gradually over time that there are incredible network effects. There's ways in which, if you look at Larry Downs' essays, he talks about information economics, Hal Varian as well. These experts have talked about the way in which there are sort of unstoppable snowballing network effects towards dominance in certain areas. And I think that we're reaping that now in some areas like in search engines and in social networks. And I think that once we take that seriously, and we see people like Rebecca McKinnon writing her book, Consent of the Networked, we see Dana Boyd, who has a wonderful post asking, is Facebook a utility? Other thought like that. Then we start seeing the necessary analogies between what's going on in the net nowadays and what types of regulation affected the media in the past. So I think that first point is to beware of monopoly. The second point, I think, which is a far more, and we can have tons of fun debates about the first point. The second point, which I think is far more difficult for the libertarian perspective to really take on and to grapple with nowadays, is the growing fusion between the corporate and the governmental sector. And they even have certain institutions called fusion centers which exemplify this, centers which involve co-location of private sector entities and public entities involving mass data surveillance. So when you have a world in which you have extraordinary concentration and collaboration of power in those ways, then the chapter of Seton's book on the future of privacy and his worries about privacy 2.0, I think, are very serious. And I think there was just a piece on Frontline last night about the Maryland Fusion Center, tracking 53 Democratic activists, including 2 nuns, through all sorts of sophisticated ways. And I think the internet, we've got to acknowledge that that allows that type of tracking, that type of collaboration. Finally, I think one under-noticed piece of Seton's is a piece that he did called Ubiquitous Human Computing, which just talks about the internet as a accelerator of inequality in many ways. Okay? Just what Walmart has done, I think, in much of the world, in many ways it's a positive thing, but in many ways we have to acknowledge that it puts a certain central node, gives them a lot of power to sort of dictate terms that can often be kind of difficult, very difficult labor terms, in other countries where it sort of it lowers transaction costs and it creates this sort of global, worldwide economic market. I think the same thing can be happening on the internet too. You see, like Amazon's Mechanical Turk giving out atomized human intelligence tasks at like 1 to 10 cents each. Okay. And I think that when you look at some of the dystopian features of those possibilities, when you see that potentially not just manufacturing, but the whole service sector ends up getting outsourced, that should worry folks, and it even worries libertarians. If you look at Robin Hanson's work on the technological singularity, look at Robin Hanson's discussion with Russ Roberts a couple weeks ago. Fascinating discussion, okay? And there's a very honest libertarian perspective that's rather bleak about the future of sort of human welfare and the possibilities for any form of equality in that realm of technological advance. So I tend to think of Google as sort of a Walmart/Goldman in its sort of intermediary power, and I want to go into that later on in more detail. But I think any of those concerns you have, if you have any concerns about large financial institutions or large retailers as intermediaries with lots of power, you should have those about internet institutions.
Except, of course, the Google slogan might be "no prices always" instead of "low prices always."
I would recommend looking at Ben Edelman's work on the setting of reserve prices and auctions for Google AdWords before, being too taken in by the freemium branding of Google services for users.
So I think this is a pretty good setting forth of that first current of debate. I do want to get Anne to sort of explain Jonathan Zittrain's particular concept of generativity and openness, and then Andrew, why don't you kind of tell us your own perspective on the internet and the future of culture? So, Anne.
Okay. All right. Well, so Jonathan Zittrain wrote this book called The Future of the Internet, and I really actually like the book a lot, but I wrote a kind of harsh review essay anyway because it's much more fun to disagree than it is to agree, right? So, it was great. Move on. No. I got all kinds of interesting little twists and takes on it. I love the internet. I don't know what I did with my free time before the internet. I definitely had a lot more of it then. But there are aspects of the internet that are very challenging. So I've been following cyber law and trying to write in cyber law since I started teaching, which was almost 14 years ago. And one of the things I can't help noticing is that 14 years ago, there were a whole lot more women in every aspect. There were more women in the industry doing computer science. This is all documentable. More women in computer science and academia who were kind of observing trends in writing. And then in cyber law, in my own field, there were more women writing about cyber law then than there are now, proportionately, but also just numerically. They've moved on to other things for various reasons, and I find that kind of alarming. So when I read Jonathan's book, I couldn't help noticing that most of the folks that Frank was talking about show up in his book. We have, Tim Wu and Larry Lessig, of course, and David Post and David Johnson and some of the early adopters to cyber law, and there were almost no women. He cites almost no women in the entire book, and it's not so much he doesn't cite to women because it's hard to find. As I said, the number has shrunk, but he doesn't seem to really care that 51% of the population doesn't seem to have much of a presence on the internet. This is something Yochai Benkler, when he wrote about the internet also, he didn't mention porn, which was an enormous, very gendered section of the internet.
There's porn on the internet?
I know, shocking. Yeah, it's hard to believe that. It's it's like funny, and people say stuff like, someone who shall be nameless who writes in cyber law was saying, well, I just don't understand what the problem is. You won't find porn. You couldn't, if you don't go looking for it, you won't find porn. It's like, what planet are you on? Like, just come look at my Google inbox or my Yahoo inbox on any given day. don't even, okay, so one time I didn't know how to spell the expression lickety-split, so I Googled it. Don't do that. Don't do that, especially not in class. Oh, my goodness. So, so there's all kinds of stuff that's going on. I'm not trying to generalize about how we should think about it, but the fact that no one is talking about it, no one is thinking about it kind of alarms me. So when I read, I have a lot of respect for Jonathan. When I read his book, I had a lot of things to learn about the book. But one of the things that I learned was that it's even more sort of masculinized, and the people that are theorizing it don't seem to know or care the way they may talk about less diversity, but his view of diversity is a very male view of diversity. Within men, are we diverse or something along those lines? So I titled my review essay "A Portrait of the Internet as a Young Man," because I really felt that was him, and that was his view of kind of the evolving internet. So as Frank laid out, he has at least one of the things he's concerned about is this idea of generativity being really important, and companies, going against that the trend being to things, he calls it baked, right? It's kind of funny for a man, he writes about giving birth and baking things, right? So there are all these sort of feminine concepts that kind of wind up in his view of the internet, but it's guys that are doing it. They're procreating, they're actually giving birth. He has Larry Lessig giving birth in the book. But so bakedness and generativity, and he comes down harshly in favor of generativity, but his very first story out of the box is that the early Apple computers, especially because Apple made some mistakes about licensing software, that the fact that people kind of spontaneously came up with applications and ways to use their early Apple computers really made the company, which I think is pretty indisputable. So then he says, and now we contrast that with the iPhone, which, at least when it was launched, and Jonathan actually has one, was very baked, okay, that you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that.
And that's what he means by generativity, right? I mean,
that's one of the things he means by,
concept,
right.
So maybe if you could just give a little more detail.
Sure. So, generativity comes up in different aspects, but it means the ability to manipulate technology. To come in as to buy a phone and to be able to do it yourself. So how many of you have actually iPhones? And then how many have Droid? Okay, so those are two options, and in some ways they're different, at least initially, because the iPhone was, at least according to Zitron, kind of baked, and the Droid was a little more open. But both of those have changed. That the iPhone now, there's a lot more apps and a lot more ability to buy independent apps and develop apps. So Apple became sort of more generative, and then the Droid had so many problems with apps that didn't work that there's actually maybe less, kind of a happy medium. And I don't think that maybe Jonathan necessarily saw that as a option in his book. The other thing I would just say quickly, I know you want to move on, is just his view of cyberspace law in the book, and he seems to be writing a little bit differently, is also there's not a lot of law in cyber law. That the people who are going to make the changes were technologists of goodwill who are going to sort of decide what the best way to go was, and there are all these kind of men who are going to decide what the best way the internet should go and implement the changes through technology. And it's never really clear, like with the Apple stuff, or if we're going to force them to be generative, how are we going to do that? Are we going to have a law that they have to be generative? Are we going to hack them? Are we going to make hacking legal so that we can hack them? And if we are going to make hacking legal, how are we going to make sure only like the good kind of hacking happens, where you develop better apps and that the bad actors don't then take advantage of this openness? So this is a lot of interesting things the book raises.
So the theme thus far is openness, closeness, control, and freedom. I think it's fair to say.
Right.
And there are, I think, three very different perspectives up here. I think Andrew's critique is starts from a different place, although you might touch on some of the same themes. Do you want to give us your short version of why you are the Antichrist of Silicon Valley?
Yeah, thank you. Well, nice to be here.
That sounded very sincere.
Well, I'm confused by a lot of things, but generally, I come from a culture, firstly, where we don't have professors of law. Law is a trade. So I've never figured out what law professors do. Now I know they study, they analyze the internet for male bias.
It's a living.
It's exactly a kind of living, I guess. Who's paying you to do that?
The taxpayers of the state of South Carolina.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, my interest is not in the law. I don't understand what the law has to do with the internet. I think one of the problems is, a lot of these law professors who clearly have nothing better to do than write books about the internet have seized control of this debate when they're not in the business of media. All these law professors are paid they're paid by their law schools to churn out articles that have no market value. So they have no understanding of media. They have no understanding. Like I'm a paid author. So when I put my work out on the market, people decide whether or not they want to buy it. And I make my living by exchanging my intellectual property, my creativity, in market terms. And law professors don't understand that because most of them have tenure. And they're paid to churn out stuff that has no market value, and their value is in teaching, which, some of them probably are good teachers. And my interest in the internet and my critique of the internet is as a market system which is struggling at the moment to pay the creative class, to pay writers, musicians, filmmakers, journalists. So my work analyzes the internet as an economic system. I'm not interested in the law. I don't care about it one way or the other, as long as I don't get arrested. I'm interested in the internet as a replacement for old media. So we have these two terms, old and new media. Old media is going away. We all know that, for better or worse. It's a reality. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against technology as such. I don't want to hold it up. I don't want to smash the machines or anything like that. I'm as wired as anyone. But what concerns me in my critique is the failure of this new media to provide an economic environment to pay the creative class. I analyze, or I look at this in 2 or 3 different ways. Firstly, I'm critical of the so-called, the idealists who believe that the old media professional class is a bad thing, that they're elites. I rejoice in that elitism. I'm in the Barry Diller school.
Except for law professors, right?
Well, I don't consider them to be part of an elite of any kind. So I think there's always a small group of people who have talent, God-given sometimes through hard work, who have the ability to create things of value and sell that value in the marketplace. In the industrial media economy, it was done through television and radio and books and all the rest of it. We all know, need to tell you about that. My concern is in the internet, you have 2 or 3 things which are undermining that professional class. Firstly, you have the curse of piracy and the open culture, free content people who take pleasure, I think, in the demise of large media, who see all media in kind of Gramscian terms as some sort of plot by a hegemonic class to control the intellectual agenda, old-fashioned argument. And then, so that's one problem. And the other problem is struggling, and I still don't see. I see some. You call me a pessimist. In some ways, I am, but in some ways, I believe in models like Netflix and Spotify. What concerns me is the way in which the internet is emerging to monetize content and to guarantee that writers, filmmakers, musicians, journalists are paid for their work. And that's why I was pessimistic, particularly in response to Web 2.0. My essay in this book is about Web 2.0 and the exuberance of the people who argued, the long tail kind of argument, that we're all going to become producers, blah, blah. You all know that argument. That's proved to be wrong. So I'm defending a professional creative class. I want to make sure that the internet becomes a platform, a mechanism, a vehicle for the distribution of that content. I think it benefits everyone. I think it benefits, obviously, that creative class, but it also benefits consumers and citizens, because if consumers and citizens are not exposed or have access to high-quality entertainment and particularly information, then they're certainly worse citizens, and they're also, I think, poorer human beings. So that's why I was, and to some extent still remain, a pessimist, although in some ways I think I'm increasingly optimistic, particularly, I think, given the way in which, the struggle against piracy seems to be winning in some ways, and there are more and more innovative business models for monetizing content on the internet. But I just want to be clear, I'm not against technology. Technology, for me, is a mirror. When we look at the internet, we're looking at ourselves. So these are these are cultural and economic arguments. They have nothing to do with technology.
So, Adam, if you could try to bring this home for us without insulting anyone on the podium or any classes of the audience.
Or law professors. Yeah, sure.
Just
We can take
how do you tie this together?
Well, I think what Andrew's articulating here is a theory of, maybe it's not pessimism, internet skepticism that basically suggests that old institutions, norms, and values are being challenged or even potentially are crumbling right before our eyes, and that this is a difficult technological transition. And we have had these before. You go back, and I start my chapter by going back to the great story of Plato has in the Phaedrus of King Thamus and the god Thuth, and the debate about the impact of writing on culture and how it will destroy oral tradition, spoken tradition around a campfire. Well, guess what? There was some truth to that story that Plato told. I mean, we no longer memorized long stories and told them around a campfire. We read them off of a scroll or something. But you know what? My take on all of this, it comes down to two words. Humans adapt. We learn to live with technological change. There are gut-wrenching changes in our midst today because of the internet. The question of how to secure and monetize intellectual property is one of the foremost and most difficult questions on that list. And I'm actually very sympathetic to some of those concerns that Andrew's raised, and he knows that. But I'm also, I think, a little bit more optimistic than him that we will find positive responses because we will learn. We will learn how to embrace and use this technology in a better way. I also try to make a pragmatic point in response to some of the criticisms and concerns that Andrew and others have raised, which is that let's say that he's right and that things are as bad as he suggests. Again, I don't buy that, but what do you want to do about it? I mean, how do you put the information genie back in the bottle? Because I think, as I point out in the book, the sort of the wind in the sails of all the optimists would be the fact that they know that the natural progression of technology is one of constant change and evolution, and barring really heavy-handed measures or steps, it's hard to disrupt these things. I think the better approach is one of education, empowerment, teaching people how to embrace new tools and technologies, how to cope with disruptive technological change. Because what I don't think I saw in Andrew's book and some of the other work of other skeptics is the answer to that question. What do you want to do to stop this nature of this change?
So that's the first chapter of the book, is this debate about Andrew's pessimism, your optimism. But what about this second sort of what you call net-loving pessimism, the skepticism about unregulated technology and whether progress will really happen without government intervening, which is what Frank was really getting at and what Anne is kind of responding to in her review of Jonathan's book.
So in response to some of what Frank said and in my essays responding to Jonathan and to Tim Wu, I've tried to make the argument, you've already stolen a lot of my thunder here, Berin, about talking about dynamism earlier on, because you know how passionately I feel about that framework of the importance of evolutionary dynamism in a free society. The fact is that we find ways to embrace these sorts of things and make change work for the better. I think the problem with the worldview that Tim and that Frank and others have is that they're too quick to jump the gun on momentary marketplace hiccups being catastrophes, a sort of call in the moment, chicken little moment where, call in the cops moment where we have to say, hey, the code cops need to come in and set things right. We're never going to evolve around this. I mean, we've heard these things before, right? I mean, you look at IBM in the 60s and 70s and Microsoft more recently. I mean, I've just always found it hard to believe that we need to have immediate interventions when patience proves to usually be the better prescription, because in my view, it's at a market's darkest moment, when it may look like it's all closed and sterile and non-generative, when the most exciting forms of innovation are happening. That's what's the kick in the pants to innovators to say, you need to get off your duff and create the next disruptive technology to take down IE if you don't like it. And that's exactly what the folks working at Netscape and then came to be known as Firefox and Mozilla, they did, and then Google did. Disruptive technology works if you give it a chance.
Can I respond to that? I mean, I do think there's been a ton of disruptive technology and really wonderful innovations on the internet. I think, though, the 2 points, though. One is that the kind of program that people like me are advancing, and I don't even think that Tim Wu offers really a program. I mean, when you look at the end of the Master Switch, all he really is arguing for is a sort of constitution of freedom. I mean, he has been arguing for net neutrality, but I think if you look at his latest work, he's basically saying to the extent there's going to be good behavior, it's going to have to be due to sort of in norms of the lead actors. I mean, I think that's the direction he's going. The train also, as Anna's pointed out, I think very eloquently in her review, really relies on non-state actors. I am one of the few people that has stuck my neck out and said, well, here's some ideas for what we could do. I think the state could do, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commissions, other entities. But the things I've proposed are minimal. I mean, the things I propose are just trying to make sure that the FTC can understand what's going on. That's what I think is important. I think that there are so many ways in which the litigation process, where people feel slighted or feel somehow that their results have come out in a way that really they shouldn't have, or feel there are privacy violations, that they can't really even look under the hood of key internet intermediaries, and we just know so little about them. Randall Strauss's book, Planet Google, says, we don't know if there's 100,000 computers or 1 million computers. There's just so many ways in which I worry that, and the reason why I'm writing this book called The Black Box Society is that I worry that we can't have a really free, open, and democratic society if you've got extremely powerful institutions at the center, both in the internet and on Wall Street, that are totally opaque. The last point that I'll make is about what I think are two interesting convergences of libertarian thought and Marxism. And one is sort of, Marx had an immiseration hypothesis. He would say, well, don't give the workers welfare because the worse things get, the more likely they will be to revolt. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, don't try to regulate the ISPs, et cetera, because the worse they make it, the more you'll get a disruptive innovation. Maybe you will. I don't know. I mean, when Google was buying up black fiber or dark fiber, that was possibly a plausible argument that they were trying to make an end run around the key players. But as Tim Wu discovered to his chagrin, he was a big supporter of Google, ultimately they decided it was easier to partner with them. It's easier to partner with the Verizon Google deal, And I was looking at that with Comcast, with Clearwire back in 2008. I predicted that basically you would see vertical integration of the layers. You wouldn't see this sort of effort by one layer to shake up the business of the other. The second sort of Marxist aspect of it is just, that we hear so much about capture. That's a very Marxian theory. The bourgeois, the state is nothing but executive committee of the bourgeois. Okay, so I think that there are ways in which overly sort of radical approaches to the existing order can wrap around, the left and the right can wrap around and meet together. And what I'm trying to defend is an ongoing role for what I think has been a successful third way, or at least a third way that offers some promise to understand what's going on, which is the foundation of any regulation, any sort of progressive action we can make in the internet field.
And
yeah, sure. I actually was going to maybe be a little grumpy for a second on the issue of dynamism and some of the practical effects of dynamism, because I actually, despite the onslaught of insults, have to agree with some of the things Andrew said in terms of content owners and where things go, with a little bit different. It's not, I think musicians and authors and movie makers have adapted. I think there's actually kind of a mixed bag in terms of who gets compensated in the models that they found, and maybe some good edges. Actually, just to stop for the movies for a second, I've started doing these things, running these 200-mile relays with my distance running team, which sounds kind of crazy, and it is kind of crazy. You get like 12 people, you run 200 miles without stopping, so you're up for 36 hours in a van, and by the end you're really tired, crabby, you smell real bad, but it's outrageously fun. But it's kind of a niche thing. And the first relay was Hood to Coast. That was the initial one. It was in Oregon, from Mount Hood to the coast. And so it took place last Labor Day, and people made a documentary film about it, because they could, right? They're using the technology, they could make it. And then using just sort of all the geeky runners, we're all kind of hooked up to the internet. There was an audience, right? There was an ability for us to bring it to our theaters and talk to each other and bring people together for a function. And the internet made all that possible. So here's a group of people who never would have made a film that was going to be at all, profitable or find an audience in any way before the internet. So that's kind of the happy side. The grumpy side is, so South Carolina has a couple of very, very ailing newspapers, right, mainstream media. And, we have a journalism school, but most of the kids that seem to graduate our journalism school want to go into marketing. They don't want to be muckrakers, and we could use some muckraking in South Carolina because we have some muck, and it needs to be raked. But in any event, so we have this newspaper called The State. And again, I moved to South Carolina. The State actually was kind of feisty, and it would take on different issues. And the University of South Carolina had some muck. And you're telling Dean, muck you, but it didn't really happen. And you needed somebody, kind of a neutral person, who would kind of look at our endowment and why every other endowment, why is Clemson endowment thriving and ours isn't? What kind of investments are being made? All these kind of questions. And the newspaper was kind of feisty about this. But then the coverage of the university dwindled, and at some point they laid off every reporter. They just stopped covering the university altogether. And the reason they did this was their presence went from being in real space on paper and ink into the internet. And as soon as they were on the internet, they could see what interested people. And you know what interests people in South Carolina? Sports, crime, weather, and death. Right, the obituaries. That's it. So that's how they ramped up their sports, they ramped up their coverage of crime, they ramped up their weather, and they ramped up their debt. Well, the obituaries didn't start killing people, as far as I know. But the people like me who wanted to see the university covered were very few and far between. No one was clicking on those articles, so they stopped. So that was a dynamism. But boy, to me that's a really bad thing. Just another more, and you may have seen something like that happen with your local newspapers. On a more macro scale, you all have antivirus protection, right? Do you ever sit back and go, wow, what an awesome deal for these antivirus companies? Just a constant revenue stream, because you just keep subscribing. Who writes these viruses? And when we think about who, there's a few people that are just sort of bad acting vandals, but there's a real profit incentive motive for viruses to keep happening here to kind of force us all to keep subscribing. And there's a dynamism story there that's maybe a little alarming too.
Well, I want to come back to you in a minute about generativity and your responses to it, but Adam, this is begging for response.
Well, there's a lot there. We could go into a whole, future of journalism discussion there, and
maybe you should write a 100-page filing about that.
I should.
Which is available online in case you want to read.
And it's 120 pages. Thank you very much. But look, there is a whole proceeding underway at the FCC and the FTC, both on this question of the future of news and journalism. And these are dark days for a lot of traditional media institutions. The internet has been a highly disruptive force in society, as I've already mentioned, and nobody has been more disintermediated than traditional media, news, entertainment operations. Again, what do you want to do about it is question one. But question two is, are there ways that we can find to live with this, that we can find to evolve? And the way I look at it, and when I look increasingly through the prism of the eyes of my children, my children, the way they reflect the new media culture, the way they consume media. And these kids aren't starving for information the way I was when I was growing up. They are subject to information overload. And it's a question of how to filter all the great stuff that's available to them. Now, there's a lot of crap, too. The cost of living in an age of information abundance is you got to sort through all the shit to find the gems. And the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of crap out there. And I have to help my daughter be a good media literate, student. My son, not so much. He's still a dimwit. But, my daughter, she really gets, this stuff because I'm teaching her how to be a savvy media consumer. We've got to do that as a culture and as a society. Now, if you want to be a pessimist and say, well, it's all these institutions struggling, they're all going under, there's no hope, we're all going to be, cave dwellers soon. I'm sorry, I think that's unwarranted. I've heard that story before. We heard it with the rise of the printing press, for God's sakes. You can go back and trace this stuff throughout history. We do, as humans, change. We have the uncanny ability as mammals to do this. And I think I'm optimistic for that reason because I've seen it happen before. Not personally seen it, but we know from history we can get through these.
So Adam, it sounds like you're implying part of your response to Frank when Frank suggests that that the libertarian response is just to sort of sit back, let things get awful, and then the invisible hand will take care of things. You're implying that there are many levels at which we ought to deal with technological change, both in terms of whether it's good for us or whether it leads to control. And what you're getting at right there is education on the very personal household level. But could you talk a little bit about how you see market forces actually working in the marketplace?
Yeah, briefly. I want to get others' input on this. But Frank's taught me today that I'm a closet Marxist, which I never knew before, which is incredible. I guess it's the new Lenin look I've got going. Again, I've already kind of made this point, so I don't want to belabor it, but I do think there is something to be said for the dynamism vision of the belief that markets aren't static, and that the snapshot mentality that I critique in my second chapter in this book is prevalent in a lot of the work that we see out there in the field of internet policy and cyber law today. These short-term static snapshots we take of a marketplace and say, oh God, look at the market power of so-and-so. I mean, and I tell the story at length in my chapter about AOL. I mean, does anybody remember just 10 years ago that we were referring to that as the new big brother, the rise of new totalitarianisms, where these were terms, I've got all the citations, all the chapter and verse, what people were saying about AOL and then AOL Time Warner. Again, it fell apart after less than 7 years, lost $100 billion for shareholders. I mean, Lessig's book is written in sort of like the AOL walled garden model was going to take us all over. And then, Code 2.0 is like, let me erase that part and just, move along to something else, because the villain had to change. And in Jonathan's book, JC's book, we find it's Apple and Steve Jobs, and also TiVo. I don't get it, but there it is. TiVo and the iPhone on page 1 and page, 350 or whatever it ends the book. They're the villains that we have to look out for. And I'm sorry, but I mean, that's not the end of the story. You don't have to own an iPhone. I don't know why Zittrain does. But, the fact of the matter is that you have choices. And markets will evolve to give you better choices. That we have to set a benchmark. There has to be a yardstick where we say, compared to this, are we or are we not better off? And my yardstick always goes back to the days, my earliest days with experience with media and technology, when I had so few choices, and when we as humans were starving for information. We were living in information poverty. And now every other book that comes across my desk that I'm reviewing these days is about how to cope with information abundance. What are we going to do about all this choice? All these choices are making us miserable. I'll take that over the past any day of the week. Give me abundance and the problems thereof over scarcity. All right, I'll shut up now.
Well, I want to take questions from the audience, but Anne, could you maybe just kind of wrap things up, because you also, this is part of your critique of Jonathan's book, is not being specific enough about responses.
Right.
That is, so he describes this problem of openness, and you cast this in somewhat genderized terms, and you have this critique of the male elite that Jonathan thinks will sort of watch over the internet and make sure that the right balance is struck between openness and closeness. And Adam's arguing that sort of happens in the marketplace anyway. Just kind of fill out your critique. Tell us what it is that you think he does and doesn't say or should say about how we ought to respond to how companies strike that balance, whether they're too much controlling what we do with our devices.
Okay. Well, actually, just to supplement just very briefly some of the things Adam was saying, I mean, Jonathan makes a really sort of scary case for the baked, generative stuff. And, I like to think I'm at least somewhat tech savvy, but I mean, I was talking about the antivirus case, other stuff. I mean, I'm really glad that is tethered, right? Like every time Adobe wants to update my ability to open PDFs and all this other kind of stuff, I don't want to have to deal with doing this manually. I'm really happy. Even though they collect some information on me and maybe they make it so I can't change my mastery of the PDF, I don't want to actually have to deal with that. I want to focus on there are certain things that I alter to my own specifications and don't. I think maybe Zittrain doesn't make enough room for that. He's critical. One of the things he was critical of
and
was...
by that you mean, again, striking the right balance.
Right.
This evolving medium.
Thank you. Thank you for grounding me and making me get to the point. I did have one. One of the things Jonathan criticizes, again, and many of the stories he tells that I found particularly surprising and was OnStar. Because, like, first of all, I don't even really get why that's an internet technology, right? Because his definition of internet was extremely broad, I thought, to include OnStar. And he's very critical of OnStar because OnStar always knows where you are and can report back to the mothership. I'm like, that's the point of OnStar. Right? The point of OnStar is for people who are kind of fearful that somehow they'll get lost or call a breakdown and they won't be able to find their cell phone or their battery will be dead and they want to push a button and have just other people deal with it. And if folks want that and they're willing to pay for it and somebody wants to provide the service, there's like nothing there that scares me. Well, okay, except that those people are on the road driving next to me. That's maybe a little alarming. But again, like, why, the market kind of solves that. I was at another conference where people are kind of railing about privacy in a certain particular way, and one of the people, who shall be nameless, another law professor, was talking about, the threats to privacy. Your cell phone has a number, and people can track you and always know where you are with your cell phone. How alarming this is. Well, the night before, I'd gone out for drinks with him, and we found the bar by using the cell phone GPS Google Maps. Like, thank God, we'd still be walking around San Francisco otherwise. So, it's a trade-off. Yeah, okay, they always know where you are, but that's really, really useful when you're trying to find directions. They can tell you, here's where you are, here's where you should turn left, and find your way around. So again, I think Zittrain is just painting, he has a thesis, and he just he just, I think, stresses out to fit all these stories into a thesis. Like, I really like his stories, and I think they're all really interesting, but I don't think they cohere.
So what is the thesis exactly?
The thesis is that, generative is better, and we should somehow work toward that end, but then it completely, as you point out, breaks down how we're going to get there, right? Him and his cool friends are going to, come up with little solutions kind of biting away at the problem, but in terms of, like, absolute bright line, the government should do this or the government should stop doing that, he's very vague.
In other words, some paternalistic elite is going to make sure this all works for us.
Unelected, and they're not law professors, right? The Andrews relief, but I mean, who are these people? And the other problem is that they're, again, I got to get back to the gender point because that's kind of what I do, is simply that, a bunch of white guy techies don't really understand necessarily some of the problems that women have on the internet. There really is a gender divide in terms of things like anonymous speech and anonymous threats that seems to have a much greater impact on women, and the solution needs to involve identifying the problem, understanding the dimensions of the problem, and working towards solutions to the problem need to involve women in a much more dramatic way, and that's not going to happen. It may not happen with the government, but it's definitely not going to happen, I think, with Zitron's crew.
Well, and I want to take questions, but it seems to me that the case you're making more generally is really about recognizing that some people don't want to tinker, right? So Jonathan wants everyone to tinker. Not everybody wants to tinker.
Right.
And so really, at a basic level, your critique and Adam's critique share a core similarity of recognizing that people are different.
Right.
And that having one group that's supposed to dictate from on high how these things work is not going to work well for everybody because of gender differences as well as just whether people are geeks, whether they want to come to an event like this and listen to law professors talk about boring law stuff. But,
and just one quick point, just to moves us in a completely different direction, so I don't want to get too much into it, but there's also a part of Zitron's book that wants to impose the First Amendment on the whole world. And that's also, even though the First Amendment's a great thing and leaves a lot of benefit, imposing that on the world through the Internet's also going to be kind of problematic, right?
Well, and in fact, that's another chapter in the book, which we're going to have a future event on, so I encourage you to keep that in mind. I wanted to start taking questions from the audience. Remember that a number of these themes will come up later today. The next panel is really all about deputizing intermediaries, and that's really what Frank and Adam have a lot to say about. But please, I think Steve Del Bianco has a question.
Thanks, Berin. Congratulations on the new launch and the new book, and fabulous panel. Really enjoyed the discussion. But in between optimism and pessimism, I think we're missing something. We're missing realism about the real problems on the internet and the lack of urgency to solve them. And our timing could not be worse. I'm talking about problems of crime, fraud, abuse, child porn, things that consumers and businesses are really frustrated about. They're frustrated about the inability of market forces and business self-reg to solve those problems. Now, at the same time, we have in the lurking these governments who are desperate for some relevance in a new world that's borderless because of the internet. And what if business and citizens start to look at governments and say, well, they've solved the financial crisis. They did okay on that. They've managed to avoid big terrorist attacks. They've even forced bad companies to clean up their oil spills. And business and citizens begin to gravitate and ask legislators to take action. That's happening while this debate's going on. I know because I deal with the fire hose of new bills coming out of state capitals and national capitals, and most of them are endorsed by some business somewhere and by citizen groups. So I feel like we're going to notice that the UN wants to help the private sector manage the internet, and government and citizens come together and come up with new legislation to solve these problems. So I would ask you, do you think there's an adequate realism about real problems on the internet and a sufficient urgency on the part of civil society and business to avoid a next digital decade where governments come in and call all the shots?
Well, I just have to respond to this libertarian stuff. I mean, I think one of the things that you might think about is that, and I agree with Clay Shirky here, that the digital revolution is a very profound one. It's a very deeply rooted one. It's not just a technological revolution. It's bound up with the emergence of post-industrial, conceivably even a post-capitalist order, and the work of so many thinkers, the work of Drucker. I mean, I don't, quite frankly, again, joking about law professors, but Jonathan Zittrain, who I like and admire, I mean, he's not the only thinker on the internet. In fact, his book, I don't think has been read by anyone else. I haven't read it. It's not read by anyone outside law schools. There are a lot of very important thinkers, someone like Peter Drucker, who thinks about knowledge and information society, who make much more important, I think, points about where we're going than some of our internet specialists. And I think what somebody like Drucker talks about is the digital world as the next major step in social, cultural, economic evolution. After he compares the digital knowledge revolution to the industrial revolutions of the 1830s and the 1870s. And this idea that, I mean, did you study history in college, Adam? Did you study the 19th century? Did you look at the way in which the early history of an almost Darwinian capitalism had to be controlled by government and external agencies for us to get to a more civilized industrial capitalist order of the 20th century? So this idea that the market always solves everything and that history proves that if you just keep your hands off, everything works out, I think can be historically absolutely demolished. And I think if we look at the digital revolution in broader, more historical, more profound cultural and economic terms, then it's very, very difficult to take this libertarian argument seriously.
So your answer to Steve's question is no or yes?
I don't know what the question was.
Adam, what's your response?
To what? To Andrew's rant or Steve's question?
What is your response to the idea that look, this is a major historical event that when you compare it in historical terms, all previous major historical events require external agencies to control and manage?
Yeah, Andrew, I'm not an anarchist. I mean, and in my work, I've made it clear. Hell, I've supported intellectual property for starters. That's intervention of a sort. I support various types of FTC-based enforcement to deal with fraud and various types of deceptive things. I've advocated through, when I worked at Progress and Freedom Foundation, a DACA model for communications reform that would have FTC-like powers transferred to the FCC to basically police neutrality questions. I mean, there's room at the margin for forms of regulation, and nobody's doubting that. The question is that going to be the standard upon which all of these decisions are made? Are we going to try to first look to preempt, to head off this sort of progress with a more static stasis mentality that says, well, we got to really go slow with the change and micromanage it at every juncture? I mean, that's what I'm expressing in my chapters.
But I think you're setting up, and I've done this in the past, I don't deny it, but you're setting up these straw men. I mean, who's really saying that?
Okay, well, let me cite your piece from 2007 in Ad Age, where we said we need to, quote, take steps to recreate media scarcity. That would be the first thing I'm against. So I could move on to other parts of your book where you're constantly belittling, insulting the digital generation as being, quote unquote, narcissistic and self-absorbed and everything else that people have hurled at youngsters for millennia. But, these sorts of moral panics and chicken little tactics really are very becoming if you want to talk about the reality of the world as we know it and how to change it for the better. I think the answer to Steve's question is to embrace a more pragmatic form of optimism or realism that understands change can be disruptive and it can have downsides and unintended consequences, but to deal with them constructively, not by labeling the new generation the lost generation and the hell with those damn kids and their newfangled technologies. We've heard it all before, from the waltz to rock and roll to the video games and the internet. And that's largely what I'm trying to debunk in my chapters.
One of the kind of other parts of things that Zittrain doesn't wrestle with and I think also needs to be raised too is, I mean, the government, at least the federal government, often would prefer not to act and just kind of punt and let the market solve. I mentioned the antivirus before, but I mean, if this was like a real virus and it's like the swine flu virus instead of a computer virus, the government's a little more interested in a public health approach. They're happy to sit back and, all this money is generated by the antivirus software. Another example was where maybe government's not even such a great thing is, remember way back with the E-rate when Al Gore was vice president and he never really said he invented the internet. Now I feel sorry for him anyway because Tipper dumped him, but he got all this money for schools and libraries to have the internet, and the next thing we know, McCain pioneers this thing with a censorware, right? And the censorware wasn't a one-time purchase. The censorware is like constant. Every month, libraries and schools have to pony up all this money to to private companies that make this censorware. Like, why didn't the government just, if they're going to say you have to censor your internet, we'll do it for you. Here's the software you install, and then we'll give you the money. The government's like very happy to sit back and let the market get involved in this, and that can be pretty troubling too.
Well, and it sounds like what you're really getting at is one of the themes of Lessig's work and Tim's work, which is that government intervention and subsidies does tend to lead to government control. So when Lessig talks about perfect control, he also talks about the increased opportunity for regulation. That is, the increased opportunity for government to come in and censor speech.
Yeah, well, my point actually was that the government both basically will intervene a little and then wants to sit back and just sort of let, people make money off of whatever the situation is without actually solving the problem.
Can
right?
I ask a question about this? You keep on talking about government intervention in media. Well, how would you describe, say, the BBC? Is that government intervention?
Adam?
Sure it is. Yeah.
So you're saying that the BBC is the voice of what? The British government? That it's some sort of, totalitarian...
Look, Andrew, I don't want to have let's not have a fight over BBC and media subsidies.
But you're throwing out these terms and you're assuming they're right, and they're not right. I mean, the idea that that any kind of government intervention in media results in government censorship or government scrutiny isn't borne out necessarily.
I didn't say that. You can read my filing on this to the FCC, and I make it clear that that's not been the case with a lot of subsidized media. That if you talk about the totality of media subsidies...
So what's the problem then with the BBC?
Well, are we going to have an argument about the BBC here? I mean, the problem with the BBC was that we only had a couple of them for about 50 years. That was the problem with the BBC. It crowded out the market for any competition. That was the biggest problem with it. Did it produce great journalism? You better believe it did, and I still watch a lot of it today, but thank God we have some alternatives to it. And you know what? At the end of the day, I'd rather not subsidize a person. I'd like to have that choice for myself. That's the difference.
So you prefer YouTube?
I think we should have another question.
Let's take another question from the audience here, please.
This is a question for Frank Pasquale, Morgan Reed with ACT. It was interesting how when Adam set it up as the pessimist viewpoint, you tried to take it and claim it was the progressive viewpoint, which is interesting when you consider that at the 25th anniversary of the .com, Bill Clinton said that the most important decision that he made as president about the internet was to realize it was a key mode of communication and then get out of the way. It's interesting as we look at the kinds of actions that people are concerned about, and Ann brought up the problems with the walled garden AOL, and we've heard that generally speaking, the progressive viewpoint, wouldn't that be one that would say, let's do more, but let's watch behavior, rather than preemptively prevent progress and move into this world where we're saying, thou shalt not, instead of starting off with, thou shalt, but maybe from a more regulatory framework, we're going to watch very carefully and start going after specific acts of behavior. So I wonder why that model of fear would be one that's better identified with the progressives, and rather maybe that's not a fair definition of the progressive viewpoint on the internet.
I do appreciate the historical context. I mean, I think that there was a real sea change under the Clinton administration in a lot of areas. I think there was, on the side of both the financial sector and the internet sector, a lot of faith that there were people who were very wise, who knew a lot about math, who were in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, who would, in a totally deregulated environment, do all that's right. And I think that clearly the internet is doing a lot better than Wall Street. Clearly there's not certainly that type of sort of meltdown that we've seen recently. But I think that the larger issue there, I think, is that right now my worry is that we don't even have the tools to understand if there's problematic behavior. I think there's just too many situations where we just don't know enough about, say, how rankings are done or what type of data is kept, auditing, other things like that. And I think that if we had more of an ability to monitor what's going on, my concerns would be assuaged. And this is not, I think, a radical position. I think that Danny Weitzner, who's I think there's really interesting sort of tensions within the current administration between, say, Department of Commerce and the FTC. Department of Commerce being, a bit more industry-oriented than the FTC on a lot of privacy questions online, other questions like that online. But even within the Department of Commerce, I think that someone like Danny Weitzner at the NTIA, I believe, is someone who is very interested in trying to understand better what's going on in these internet intermediaries. So I think that would be the the movement I would make more towards an effort to say, do we really know there's not stealth marketing going on? Do we really know that, that all of the AdWord auctions are on the up and up? What would it hurt to have a few audits of those things every once in a while? And I think that that's what's driving perhaps what's going on in Europe. And the larger lesson, I think, for American industry is that Europe, maybe we shouldn't allow Europe to become the de facto regulator when we sort of step out of the field, because that's what it may well do if we don't. Yeah.
Between transparency and prevention.
Yeah, I think that the transparency and some auditing of industry practices would do a lot to assuage the concerns of folks like me and others.
We have time for one more question. Jim?
Thank you. I'm Jim Duncan, the founder of Mobius Legal Group and an adjunct to TechFreedom, although I may be depinned after this question. But one thing that struck me, and I'd like the response to it, on the issue of dynamism, generativity, optimism in Silicon Valley, I was really struck by, Berin, the interview and then the comments here. If dynamism is, in fact, a way in which there is radical change, and yet optimism is coming out of Silicon Valley, if, in fact, dynamism is true, doesn't the whole model for Silicon Valley fall apart? Because don't, in fact, venture capitalists invest into these new businesses not because they think they're going to be displaced in 2 or 3 years, but they think they're going to be the next Apple, they're going to be the next Microsoft, and have a generation of profits to then get their earnings back from. If dynamism and generativity takes off in anything approaching a Moore's law, doesn't it break down the entire Silicon Valley model?
Yeah, so the question is, how long is a generation? And I think Adam would probably agree with me here that what we're talking about is not the idea that nobody can achieve domination in a marketplace, but the question of how long it lasts. And my answer is, yeah, if you look at, and I think Tim Wu's book, Master Switch, is very accurate in this respect, that he basically describes Schumpeter's theory of capitalism, where you have, especially in technologically dynamic industries, you have the rise of one giant in field, and then that is eventually replaced by another. And I think essentially what we're seeing is that the replacement times are becoming shorter, right? So this is somewhat akin to the rapid pace or the increasing pace of technological change itself, and I'm fine with that. I think, and this is a really fundamental question here, right? Is and this is, I think, in part what Adam was getting at when he talked about critiquing the static snapshot mentality. If you think that it's only fair or that consumers will only be protected if the marketplace looks like Adam Smith's perfect competition model, you're going to be very disappointed in digital markets. And if you take that starting place, you're probably going to be led to argue for intervention. On the other hand, if you believe that actually consumers can be protected pretty well in marketplaces where at any given time there may in fact only be one dominant player, but that the key question is how long that dominant player can stay on top and whether there is the potential of someone lurking around the next corner to displace them, you can be very comfortable with technological change. And you can also understand why, to get to your very, I think, astute question, why venture capitalists are willing to fund companies that can stay on top for a while in hopes that either that generation, however short it is enough to justify their returns, or that company may be the exception to the rule, right? Because every investor thinks that the one that they're putting their money on, it's in some sense betting, is the one that's going to last, even if history doesn't really bear that out.
And in fact, if you take specific examples, you actually can rebut Andrew Keen again, which, those comments about law professors did burn. But like take the music industry, okay? So we've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen, right, 8-track tapes, or it's like clunky, and then cassette tapes, and then, CDs, and then the MP3 files. But the music, the most important part of the music, the part that sticks over time, is someone has to write the songs. That we still don't have computers that write songs that anyone wants to listen to, so we have to make sure that people are still incentivized to write and perform the songs. That's the part that's constant. So that part, ensuring that we have all the Napsters and the iTunes all have an incentive to make sure songs are written.
But the thing is that if we had Rick Carnes here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rick Carnes. He's the head of the American Songwriters Guild. So I'm not going to speak. Let me just pretend I was Rick if he was here. What he would say to you is that he has no problems with all these different technologies replacing one another, because it didn't undermine the ability of the songwriter or the musician to earn a livelihood, whether it was the sale of vinyl or 5/6 track or CD or cassette. The problem that Rick would say is that in our internet environment, in this sort of anarchistic world where people are turning a blind eye to piracy, the ability for the songwriter and the musician to earn a living is going away. So that would be, it's got nothing to do with technological pessimism. It's just a reality. That's the world he's living in. He's seeing more and more of his fellow songwriters losing their jobs because there simply isn't the opportunity. Now, you could argue, well, they're going to have to be policemen, or they could become investors, or they could become, you know, other types of creative people. Perhaps that's
professors,
true, right? They could become law professors. But do we want to lose our songwriters? Do we want to, you know, we're living again at this really revolutionary cultural point where the hand workers of the old cultural system are being replaced by someone else. Now, I don't want to suggest that you can or you'd want to hold up history. But this idea that you guys have that somehow history moves forward so quickly that anyone who even questions what's happening is a reactionary and a Luddite is just as absurd as the Ludditism that destroyed machines. I mean, we have to be able to criticize technological change because it's so central to our lives. And one of the things that troubles me about your approach is you're treating it as if it's this sort of a game, a free market game, when it actually affects real people's lives in cultural terms, in the way they live their lives. And you have to acknowledge that. You can't just look at it purely as proof of the purity of the market.
Well, I think Andrew's going to have the last word. For my part, I would simply say that you've heard plenty of criticism here today, so obviously no one's trying to squelch criticism of change, and also to be realistic, as I think we're all trying to be, about the fact that change is hard, and the question is how we deal with it. I think that's essentially Adam's message. That's certainly the message that we're going to be dealing with at TechFreedom. Is not it's not Pollyanna-ish optimism. It's a pragmatic and a rational one that, as Steve's question was getting at, tries to grapple with real questions and look at the least restrictive ways of dealing with them. So anyway, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I encourage you to read their chapters in the book, as well as the chapters of others who contributed on these topics. So I'd like to ask our second panel to come up on internet exceptionalism and the question of deputizing and requiring online intermediaries to police the internet. And while they're coming up here, I'm going to turn things over to Adam, but I do just want to say that the question that was asked about the 25th anniversary of the Internet did remind me that I was remiss in my introduction and remarks in mentioning that this book actually grew out of that anniversary, and I really have to thank Shane Tews at VeriSign, who's sitting somewhere here in the audience, back here on the right, I think. This book was really a commemoration of the first 25 years of the commercial Internet, and a celebration in that sense of everything that .com and the commercial Internet symbolizes. So it really wouldn't have happened without her support. So Adam's going to moderate the next panel, which I'm sure will be quite a great debate.
Thank you, Berin.